The day I became the most hated person in my neighborhood was the day I discovered I owned it. It started with a ridiculous $50 fine, an audacious challenge to my peace, and the kind of woman who saw a tranquil lake as her personal kingdom to micromanage. What she didn't know was that I had inherited something far more valuable than a mere lakeside cottage. I promise you won't see this ending coming. Let me know in the comments what you would have done if you found yourself in my shoes, facing down an HOA tyrant. My name is Clara Vance, and for 47 years, my life had been a series of calculated risks and strategic maneuvers, mostly within the confines of a corporate law firm where I had carved out a formidable reputation as a real estate and mergers and acquisitions specialist. I had orchestrated multi-million-dollar deals, navigated labyrinthine legal battles, and outmaneuvered opponents who thought their resources were infinite. But none of that prepared me for the quiet, insidious tyranny of an HOA president. I had left that world behind, seeking solace and serenity after the sudden, devastating loss of my husband, Thomas. He had been the steady anchor in my life, a man who found profound peace in the simple act of fishing, a man who dreamed of a lakeside retirement. When he passed, the very idea of returning to the cutthroat world of corporate law felt like a betrayal of his memory and of the future we had envisioned together. So I sold our sprawling city home, liquidated my stake in the firm, and found myself drawn to Serenity Lakes, a master-planned community built around a shimmering, man-made body of water in a quiet corner of the state. The cottage I bought was small, unassuming, but it had a dock, a tiny patch of lawn that sloped gently to the water's edge, and an ancient willow tree that dipped its weeping branches into the placid surface. It was, quite simply, perfect. It was the sanctuary I craved, a place where the only battles I anticipated were with stubborn fishing knots or the occasional squirrel trying to raid my bird feeder. It was Thomas's dream, realized, even if he wasn't there to share it. Every morning, I would sit on the small wooden dock, a mug of steaming coffee in my hand, watching the sunrise paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, the only sounds the gentle lapping of water against the pilings and the distant call of a loon. This lake, this cottage, it wasn't just property. It was a tangible link to Thomas, a vessel for my grief, and a promise of healing. It was my sacred space. That peace, however, was destined to be short-lived. The serpent in my garden arrived in the form of Delia Harrington, the esteemed, self-appointed empress of the Serenity Lakes Homeowners Association. Delia was everything I had spent my life avoiding: loud, ostentatious, and perpetually clad in designer athleisure where that clung to her perfectly sculpted frame. Her platinum blonde hair was always impeccably coiffed, a severe, helmet-like style that screamed, to my experienced eyes, "I want to speak to the manager," in a very expensive tone. She drove a pristine, oversized white sports utility vehicle, the kind that never saw a dirt road, and her every utterance was delivered with the clipped, imperious cadence of someone utterly convinced of their own infallible authority. She presented as wealthy, not just financially, but in an almost spiritual sense of entitlement. She was the kind of woman who believed rules were for other people, unless she was the one making them. Our first true confrontation was almost laughably petty, a harbinger of the grand war to come. I had bought a small, electric-powered dinghy, just big enough for me and my fishing gear, and I would motor out onto the lake in the quiet hours of dawn, casting my line, feeling closer to Thomas with every ripple. It was the antithesis of everything fast and noisy, a whisper on the water. One Tuesday morning, as I was slowly making my way back to my dock, a shadow fell over me. Delia's white SUV, incongruously large and aggressive for our narrow, winding lakeside roads, screeched to a halt on the small access road nearest my property. She emerged, arms crossed, sunglasses perched on her nose like a predatory bird. "Ms. Vance," she began, her voice cutting through the morning stillness, amplified by some unseen, internal megaphone. "I must inform you that your activities on the lake are in violation of multiple HOA covenants." I lifted an eyebrow, pausing my electric motor. "Good morning, Delia. To what, specifically, are you referring?" My voice was calm, a habit honed over years of negotiating with volatile clients. She scoffed, a theatrical expulsion of air. The boat, Miss Vance. That craft. It's an ecological menace. It's disturbing the waterfowl, endangering the fragile ecosystem of our lake. She gestured grandly to the water, as if personally responsible for its very existence. Section 4, subsection C, paragraph 7 clearly states, no motorized vehicles are permitted on the lake without prior written approval from the HOA board, which, I might add, you most certainly do not possess. Furthermore, your fishing activities, specifically the use of live bait, are attracting invasive species. This will be a $50 fine and a formal warning. Cease and desist immediately. I felt a slow burn begin in my chest. Live bait? The ecological menace of an electric motor? I had been using artificial lures, a practice Thomas had taught me to minimize impact. Delia, I said, my voice still level, though it was costing me effort. My boat is electric. It produces zero emissions, makes virtually no noise. It's far less intrusive than a paddleboard. And I assure you, I use only lures. Electric is still motorized, Miss Vance, she declared, her chin jutting out, her expression a mask of righteous indignation. The bylaws are clear. And your word on the lures means nothing. Rules are rules. This community thrives on order, Miss Vance. And order, I am afraid, is something you seem intent on disrupting, she smirked, a cruel twist of her perfectly painted lips, then turned and marched back to her SUV, leaving me simmering in the morning sun, a petty fine slip fluttering to the ground near my feet. The injustice of it was a bitter taste. I stood there on my dock, the $50 fine slip feeling heavier than any legal brief I had ever held. My initial reaction was a familiar surge of hot anger, the kind that had fueled me through countless late nights and aggressive depositions. But then, a wave of exhaustion washed over me, a weariness that went bone deep. This was exactly what I had fled. The petty squabbles, the self-important tyrants, the constant need to be on, to fight. I had come here for peace, for quiet. Was a $50 fine worth a full-blown war? Could I just pay it, tie up my little boat for good, and find another way to connect with Thomas's memory? I weighed the options, the desire for serenity battling against the visceral need for justice. My mind, still hardwired for strategic analysis, began to simulate scenarios. Complying would be easier in the short term, but it would be a capitulation, a surrender of my personal space, my sanctuary. It would validate Delia's bullying, embolden her. And the thought of that, of letting her arrogant assumption of power go unchallenged, curdled in my stomach. I pictured Thomas, his quiet strength, his unwavering belief in fairness. He wouldn't have stood for it. He'd have smiled that slow, knowing smile of his and then found a way, a clever, precise way, to cut through the noise and expose the truth. It was a memory of Thomas that truly solidified my resolve. I remembered a conversation we had just before he passed, sitting on this very dock. He had been talking about his grandfather, a man who had faced down corrupt local politicians in his small town, never backing down from what was right, even when it was difficult. Integrity, Clara, Thomas had said, his eyes on the shimmering water. It's not just about what you do when people are watching. It's about what you stand for when no one else is. It's about protecting the things that matter, even when the fight seems small. My small boat, the fishing, the lake itself, these were not just hobbies. They were echoes of Thomas, a tangible link to our life together. This wasn't just a $50 fine. It was an assault on my healing, on his legacy. I would not be bullied. The sleeping giant within me, the litigator who had won impossible cases, began to stir. The decision made, the anger sharpened into a cold, meticulous focus. My professional expertise, honed over decades of corporate litigation and complex real estate transactions, wasn't just a job, it was a superpower. Delia Harrington had made a critical mistake. She had assumed I was just another grieving widow, an easy mark. She had no idea the extent of my capabilities, the depths of my professional network, or the sheer, unadulterated pleasure I derived from uncovering hidden truths in dusty archives. This wasn't a $50 fine anymore. This was a declaration of war, and I intended to win. I started methodically the way I always did. The HOA bylaws were my first target. I downloaded every single document available on their website, cross-referencing versions, looking for amendments, anomalies, anything. I then moved to the county records office, spending hours sifting through microfiche and digital databases. I requested every single plat map, deed, and easement related to Serenity Lakes. I wasn't just looking for proof of Delia's overreach. I was looking for the foundational documents, the original intent, the true legal bones of this community. I researched the original developers, their corporate structures, their dissolution, and the eventual transfer of all assets. It was tedious, painstaking work, but it was also exhilarating. It felt familiar, like slipping back into a well-worn, incredibly powerful suit of armor. Each document, each obscure legal reference, was a piece of a puzzle. Then came the truly crucial phase, the land records related to the lake itself. Most master plan communities I knew either dedicated the lake as common property to the HOA or maintained it as a separate, privately owned amenity. I pulled every deed, every easement, every recorded document pertaining to the water body and the land beneath it. I cross-referenced parcel numbers, surveyed legal descriptions, and checked for any environmental impact statements or state permits. The initial findings were confusing, a tangle of corporate entities and defunct trusts. But I persisted, tracing each thread, following the paper trail wherever it led. And then, the revelation hit me, a bolt of pure, electrifying understanding. It wasn't a single document, but the confluence of several, meticulously cross-referenced. The original developer, a consortium named Serenity Holdings, had built the community in the late 1980s. When they finally dissolved, they had conveyed the residential lots and the common areas, the clubhouse, the pool, the decorative gardens, to the newly formed Serenity Lakes Homeowners Association. But the lakebed itself, the actual land beneath the water, had never been explicitly conveyed. It was still listed under a subsidiary of Serenity Holdings, a shell corporation that had subsequently been acquired by another, larger development group, then another, and another, through a series of complex mergers and acquisitions, each one burying the original ownership deeper under layers of corporate restructuring. I traced the final transfer, a seemingly innocuous entry in a massive, decades-old corporate dissolution filing. The last remaining assets of that final development group, including any unlisted or unassigned parcels, had been folded into a blind trust established for a former executive, a man named Bartholomew Thorne, as part of his retirement package. Bartholomew Thorne. The name resonated deep within me, pulling at a forgotten chord. Thomas's maternal grandfather had been Bartholomew Thorne. My heart hammered in my chest. I scrambled through old family documents, yellowed photographs, and Thomas's meticulously organized files. There it was, Bartholomew Thorne, a quiet, shrewd real estate investor who had made a fortune decades ago and, in a fit of unexpected foresight, had established a trust for his descendants, making Thomas and, by extension me, his primary beneficiaries and, astonishingly, the ultimate trustees after his son, Thomas's father, had passed. The trust documents were clear, ironclad, and had been signed by a parade of very expensive lawyers. The lakebed, the entire underlying property of Serenity Lakes, was not owned by the HOA. It was owned by my trust. I owned the lake. The realization was akin to a tidal wave, washing away the fatigue, the grief, and replacing it with a surge of cold, exhilarating power. Delia Harrington had declared war on the wrong person. She had stepped onto a battlefield she didn't even know existed, and I held the ultimate weapon. The sheer absurdity of it all almost made me laugh aloud. Delia Harrington, pompous and self-important, had been lording over a lake that belonged to me, a lake that had, unknowingly, been a part of my family's legacy for decades. The thought was a deliciously ironic twist of the knife. But before I made any rash moves, I needed a second, third, and fourth opinion. I picked up the phone and called Arthur Finch, my former mentor from the corporate law days. Arthur was a legend, a wizened, sharp-witted man in his late 70s who had forgotten more about real estate law than most lawyers ever learned. He had a dry wit and an uncanny ability to see through bureaucratic nonsense. "Arthur," I began, trying to keep the tremor of excitement out of my voice, "I have a hypothetical for you." He chuckled, his voice raspy. "Hypotheticals, Clara, are usually the precursor to either something very brilliant or very stupid. Which is it?" I laid out the convoluted chain of title, the obscure trust, the HOA's presumption of ownership. I heard a long, low whistle on the other end of the line. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that the Serenity Lakes HOA has been operating under the assumption that they own the lake, when in fact, your trust, as the successor to Bartholomew Thorne, holds the fee-simple title to the lake bed?" "That's precisely what the documents suggest," I confirmed, a smile finally breaking through. "Every deed, every plat, every corporate filing points to it. The HOA was conveyed the common areas, but not the water feature itself." Arthur was silent for a moment, then burst into a genuine belly laugh, a sound I hadn't heard in years. "Clara, my dear, this isn't just brilliant, it's a masterpiece. This is the kind of hidden landmine that makes real estate law truly exciting. Oh, to be 30 years younger and get my teeth into this." He quickly sobered, his voice sharpening. "The implications are enormous. Without title, the HOA has no legal standing to impose regulations on the lake itself. No fines, no rules, no prohibitions. They've been operating entirely outside their legal purview concerning that asset. This Delia Harrington character, as you've described her, is about to learn a very painful lesson about due diligence." He offered strategic advice, validating my meticulous research. "Your first step is to continue gathering evidence of their overreach. Let them dig their own grave, Clara. The deeper they go, the harder they'll fall. Document everything. Their rules, their fines, their threats. We'll build an airtight case." He offered to consult pro bono, just for the sheer joy of it. His validation was the final piece of the puzzle, turning my theoretical understanding into an actionable battle plan. The strategy began to coalesce in my mind, a multi-phase operation worthy of a corporate takeover. Phase 1. Silent escalation. I would allow Delia Harrington to continue overplaying her hand, building a stronger case against her. My hidden ownership was the ultimate weapon, but revealing it too soon would simply lead to a messy, protracted legal battle. I wanted a swift, decisive, public unmasking. Phase 2. Meticulous evidence gathering. I installed discrete security cameras around my property, particularly aimed at the lake and my dock, to record any further encroachments or harassment. I started a dedicated folder on my computer, categorizing every email, every fine, every interaction with the HOA. I reached out to other residents, subtly at first, through casual conversations at the community mailbox or while walking my dog. I learned that Delia's reign of terror wasn't limited to me. She had a history of petty tyrannies, architectural requests denied for frivolous reasons, arbitrary fines for unkempt lawns, even when they were immaculate, strict enforcement of pool hours that inconvenienced working parents, and a general air of condescension towards anyone who dared to question her. I found a small, simmering community resistance, a group of quiet people who had suffered under Delia's iron fist. They shared their stories, their frustrations, their documented grievances, unwittingly contributing to my arsenal. One woman, Eleanor, told me how Delia had fined her $100 for a bird bath that was not architecturally harmonious with the community, despite it being a standard ceramic piece. A retired couple, the Millers, showed me a cease and desist letter for daring to plant lavender in their front yard, which Delia deemed too fragrant for the neighborhood's delicate sensibilities. Each story fueled my resolve, transforming this personal vendetta into a fight for the community's collective freedom. This was no longer just about Thomas's Lake. It was about dismantling an oppressive regime. My first official countermove was subtle, a legally sound jab rather than a knockout punch. I had Arthur draft a carefully worded letter to the HOA board, referencing specific sections of the bylaws and state corporate statutes. It wasn't accusatory, merely inquisitive, posing a series of pointed questions about the precise legal basis for the HOA's authority over the lake, requesting copies of all deeds, easements, and state environmental permits that substantiated their regulatory claims. It was a polite request for documentation, the kind of inquiry that, to an untrained eye, might seem innocuous. But to an experienced lawyer, it was a precise opening salvo, an invitation for them to reveal the weakness of their position. Delia's response was precisely what I had anticipated, an arrogant dismissal. She responded personally, via email, bypassing the HOA's official legal counsel. Her reply was a masterpiece of corporate jargon and thinly veiled threats, dismissive of my frivolous inquiries, she asserted, without providing a shred of evidence, that the HOA's authority was well-established and long-standing, and that continued, vexatious litigation would result in further fines and even the suspension of my community privileges. She even copied a few other HOA board members, assuming their unwavering loyalty. It was a perfect example of her hubris, her complete lack of respect for due process, and her reliance on bluster rather than facts. Her overreach didn't stop there. Buoyed by her perceived victory, she escalated. At the next HOA meeting, a thinly attended affair where most residents had long given up hope of their voices being heard, Delia singled me out during her president's report. She painted a picture of me as a troublesome, litigious individual who was disrupting the harmony of the community. Some residents, she announced, her gaze sweeping pointedly over me, believe they are above the rules. They question established authority, they endanger our precious wildlife with their unauthorized watercraft, and they refuse to pay their dues. She then publicly announced an increase to my lake violation fine, raising it from $50 to $250, citing aggravated nuisance as the reason. The flimsy no boating signs she had installed along the lake perimeter, some even crossing onto private property lines, now seemed almost like a personal challenge. She even tried to float a motion to prohibit all fishing from private docks, a move that drew murmurs of discontent from the few residents present, but which she quickly quelled with a glare and a forceful gavel. The line was finally, irrevocably crossed a week later. Thomas's birthday. I had quietly, privately, placed a small, engraved brass plaque on a smooth stone near the water's edge beneath the willow tree, a simple tribute. Thomas Vance. May your spirit forever find peace on these waters. It was discreet, barely visible unless you knew it was there, a quiet act of remembrance for the man who had brought me to this place. When I went down to the dock that morning, the plaque was gone. In its place, a neatly folded, laminated note from the HOA. Unapproved structure. Removed in accordance with Section 3, Article 7 of the Architectural Guidelines. Retrieval from HOA office requires a $75 processing fee. My hands trembled with a cold fury. This wasn't about rules or bylaws anymore. This was a direct, personal assault on my grief, on Thomas's memory, on the very essence of my sanctuary. The arbitrary fines, the public shaming, I could have rationalized as typical HOA power tripping. But touching Thomas's memorial? That was an unforgivable act, a desecration. Any lingering desire for a peaceful resolution evaporated. The sleeping giant was fully awake, and she was preparing to unleash a storm. With Arthur's guidance, and fortified by the furious resolve born from Delia's desecration, I began to execute the master plan. The first step was to secure the necessary state permits. While the HOA had no authority over my privately owned lakebed, state environmental regulations for private water bodies were a real concern. I had diligently researched these, consulting with a state environmental lawyer Arthur recommended. My small electric boat, my fishing activities, they were all well within compliance. I applied for a recreational lake use permit, not because I needed the HOA's permission, but because it established my right to use the water and provided an official record of my activities with the state, bypassing any local HOA interference. It was approved within weeks, a simple formality given the minimal environmental impact of my activities. Next came the formal notice. Not to the HOA, not yet. To the State Environmental Protection Agency, to the County Planning Department, and to the Department of Natural Resources. I informed them, with precise legal language and supporting documentation that the Serenity Lakes HOA had been falsely claiming jurisdiction over a privately owned water body, mine, and that their recent actions, including the installation of unauthorized signs and the attempted restriction of legal activities, might constitute interference with private property rights and potentially violate environmental regulations related to private water body access. It was a quiet warning shot, a bureaucratic tripwire. Then, the legal hammer. Arthur, acting as my official counsel, filed a comprehensive lawsuit against the Serenity Lakes Homeowners Association and, specifically, Delia Harrington, in her capacity as president and individually. The suit outlined multiple causes of action: tortious interference with private property, breach of fiduciary duty for misrepresenting the HOA's authority, defamation for her public statements, and conversion for the theft of Thomas's memorial plaque. We also sought an injunction to prevent the HOA from any further interference with my private property rights, specifically my use of the lake. The damages sought were substantial, including punitive damages for Delia's malicious conduct. The legal strategy was designed not just to win, but to utterly dismantle Delia's authority and ensure she faced personal consequences. The stage was set for the annual HOA meeting, usually a dull, perfunctory affair, but this year, I had ensured it would be a spectacle. I had subtly spread the word among the community resistance that something big was going to happen, and an unusually large number of residents were present, murmuring with anticipation. Delia, oblivious to the storm brewing around her, strutted to the podium, radiating her usual smug self-satisfaction. She began her president's report with a lengthy, self-congratulatory monologue about the HOA's achievements under her leadership, peppered with veiled references to my disruptive behavior and the importance of adherence to community standards for the good of all. She even showed a slide of a blurry photograph of my boat, labeling it an environmental hazard. When she finally opened the floor for questions, I raised my hand. Delia's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. Yes, Ms. Vance. Though I must warn you, if this is another attempt to question our established rules, I will have to ask you to sit down. I stood, calmly, clutching a neatly organized binder filled with documents. Thank you, President Harrington. I assure you, my questions are not about questioning the HOA's rules, but rather about understanding their applicability to certain assets within this community. My voice was clear, controlled, every word precisely enunciated. Specifically, the lake. Delia scoffed. The lake, Ms. Vance, is common property, owned and managed by the HOA, as you well know. Is it though? I asked, a slight, almost imperceptible smile playing on my lips. President Harrington, could you please direct the board and the residents to the specific deed or recorded plat that conveys ownership of the lakebed and thus jurisdiction over the lake itself to the Serenity Lakes Homeowners Association? Delia blinked, momentarily thrown off. That's a matter of public record. It's understood. It's always been understood. Understood, perhaps, but not documented, I fear. I continued, pulling out a copy of a county plat map, enlarged and highlighted. Here is the original plat map for Serenity Lakes, filed in 1987. As you can see, Parcel 3B, which constitutes the entire lakebed, is clearly delineated. And here, I pulled out another document, is the original conveyance deed from Serenity Holdings to the Serenity Lakes Homeowners Association for the common areas. As you will note, Parcel 3B is conspicuously absent. A murmur swept through the room. Delia's face was turning a mottled shade of red. This is ridiculous, Ms. Vance. This is old information. The lake has always been HOA property. Always, perhaps. In your estimation, President Harrington, I said, my voice hardening, but not in the eyes of the law. I spent the last several months tracing the complete chain of title for Parcel 3B. It was retained by Serenity Holdings, then passed through a series of corporate acquisitions, until its final disposition as an asset within the Bartholomew Thorne Family Trust. I paused, letting the weight of the name hang in the air. Then I delivered the coup de grace. And as of last year, President Harrington, I am the sole trustee and beneficiary of the Bartholomew Thorne Family Trust, which means, quite simply, that I own the lake. Every inch of the lake bed, from shore to shore. The room erupted. Gasps, exclamations, bewildered whispers. Delia's jaw literally dropped. Her eyes darted around frantically, seeking support, finding none. "This is a lie," she shrieked, her carefully cultivated composure shattering. "You can't own the lake. This is preposterous." "Preposterous, perhaps, but entirely legal," I retorted, projecting my voice across the chaos. I held up a large, official-looking document. "And just to demonstrate my intent to operate within all legal frameworks, here is the state-approved recreational lake use permit, issued to me, Clara Vance, as the owner of Parcel 3B. This permit, President Harrington, authorizes me to operate my electric boat and fish on my property. Activities which you fine me for, activities for which you levied exorbitant fees, activities for which you removed a personal memorial from my private property." I produced a photograph of the now empty stone, then a copy of the HOA's fine notice for the plaque. The room was in an uproar. Residents were shouting, demanding explanations. Delia was visibly shaking, fumbling for her phone. "I'm calling our lawyers," she stammered, her voice high-pitched and frantic. "I've already done that for you, President Harrington," I said, with a chilling calm. "In fact, I've done more than that. As of this morning, the Serenity Lakes Homeowners Association and you, personally, have been served with a lawsuit for tortious interference with private property, breach of fiduciary duty, defamation, and conversion. We are seeking substantial damages. And I have also filed for a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction to prevent the HOA from any further interference with my property rights, including the use of my lake." I laid copies of the filed lawsuit and the injunction request on the podium. Her authority, built on a foundation of sand, instantly collapsed. Residents, those who had suffered under her capricious rule, now saw her for what she was, a bully with no actual power. Someone yelled, "Vote of no confidence." The cry was quickly taken up by others. Delia made a pathetic attempt to regain control, banging her gavel uselessly against the podium, her face contorted in a mask of impotent rage and disbelief. But it was over. Her reign, her meticulously crafted illusion of power, was shattered into 1,000 pieces. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Delia Harrington, facing not only a vote of no confidence, but also a very real, very expensive lawsuit, resigned in disgrace within 48 hours. Her grand, blustering pronouncements about consulting their lawyers quickly turned to panicked, hushed conversations as her own legal team confirmed the undeniable truth. The HOA had no leg to stand on. Their authority over the lake was non-existent. The lawsuit proceeded, and the evidence I had meticulously gathered, from the initial $50 fine to the stolen memorial plaque, proved damning. The other residents, emboldened by Delia's downfall, came forward with their own stories of harassment and arbitrary fines, strengthening my case. Delia tried to settle, then tried to fight, but with each passing week, her position became more untenable. The legal fees mounted, and it became clear she was facing not just financial ruin but potential charges for misrepresentation and, in the case of the plaque, outright theft. Eventually, she was forced to sell her meticulously manicured home at a significant loss, a forced exile from the community she had so arrogantly controlled. She left Serenity Lakes in the dead of night, her white SUV, once a symbol of her authority, now a hearse for her shattered ego. Now, in a position of total power, I had a choice. I could have locked down the lake, restricted access, and become the very kind of authoritarian I had just defeated. But that was never my intention. This wasn't about personal enrichment. It was about justice and about honoring Thomas's legacy. My goal was to restore peace and create a fair, equitable system for the community. I dictated new terms, not as a tyrant, but as a benevolent steward. I convened a special community meeting without the oppressive glare of Delia's former board. I presented a new proposal. The lake, I announced, would remain open to the residents of Serenity Lakes for recreational use. I established clear, simple rules. Electric motors only, no live bait, designated swimming areas, and respect for wildlife. I proposed a nominal annual fee, a single dollar, for the HOA to formally lease access to the lake from the Bartholomew Thorne Family Trust. This legally binding agreement formally acknowledged my ownership while guaranteeing community access, forever preventing another Delia from claiming the lake as her personal domain. It was a win-win, ensuring the lake's preservation while allowing everyone to enjoy its beauty. A new, ethical HOA board was quickly elected, composed of the quiet, sensible residents who had been part of the community resistance. Eleanor, the woman with the bird bath, became the new president, and the Millers, the retired couple, joined the Architectural Review Committee, promising a more reasonable and resident-friendly approach. The days of arbitrary fines and petty tyrannies were over. The community was demonstrably better off, breathing a collective sigh of relief, finally able to enjoy their homes and the beautiful natural environment without fear of retribution. Life by the lake returned to its intended tranquility. I often sit on my dock now, fishing with my quiet electric boat, the early morning mist rising from the water. The sun warms my face, and the only sounds are the gentle dip of my fishing line and the happy shouts of children playing by the shore, their laughter echoing across the water, a sound that had been notably absent during Delia's oppressive reign. The new HOA board, led by Eleanor, has already implemented several positive changes, including community-wide cleanup days around the lake and even a small, annual fishing tournament that celebrates the lake, rather than restricting it. Thomas's memory is not just protected now, it is honored. I had a new, larger, more permanent plaque installed on a beautiful granite stone near the community access point to the lake. It reads, "The Thomas Vance Community Lake Access Point, dedicated to the enduring spirit of peace, community, and the quiet enjoyment of nature." It's a small monument, but it serves as a powerful reminder of what was almost lost and what was ultimately saved. The lake, once a point of contention, is now a symbol of collective freedom and respect. My journey from grieving widow seeking solace to an unlikely champion of justice taught me invaluable lessons. Bullies, I reaffirmed, often defeat themselves with their own arrogance and lack of foresight. True power doesn't come from loud pronouncements or self-appointed authority. It comes from quiet knowledge, meticulous preparation, and the unwavering conviction to stand up for what is right, even when the fight seems small and insignificant. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon in your arsenal is the one no one knows you possess. And sometimes, to find your peace, you first have to declare war.